Good day. Yesterday, or to be precise, the day before I have made this video, the United States and Russian governments both announced that President Putin and President Biden would meet in Geneva on 16th June 2021 to hold their much talked about summit. The announcements which were made by both governments were brief and very much to the point. The Kremlin statement confirming the agreement to hold the summit, especially so. I will read the Kremlin statement, which is short and crisp. In accordance with the agreement, President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, will hold talks with President of the United States, Joseph Biden, in Geneva on 16th June. The two presidents will discuss the current status of and prospects for bilateral relations, strategic stability problems, as well as current issues on the international agenda, including cooperation in countering the pandemic and settlement of regional conflicts. This summit meeting follows a succession of conversations between the national security advisors of the two presidents, Jake Sullivan, who is the national security advisor of President Biden, and Nikolai Patrushev, who is the national security advisor of President Putin. Sullivan and Patrushev have had several telephone conversations over the course of the last few weeks, and a few days ago they actually met face-to-face in Geneva. That meeting was clearly the key one, the one where the agenda for the summit was finally agreed, enabling an agreement to hold the summit to be formally announced. I would add that the Sullivan-Patrushev discussions have gone almost entirely unreported in the international media. And of course, it is not just the Sullivan-Patrushev meetings which have gone unreported. One of the most remarkable things about this announcement of the summit is that it went almost entirely unreported also. In the hours after the two governments confirmed that the summit would take place, I checked the American, British and European medias, and I found almost total silence. Barely any newspaper in Britain, for example, reported the fact that the two presidents were due to meet in Geneva next month. The only newspaper which seemed to cover the story to any extent was the Financial Times. In the United States, there was a little more coverage, and in some places in Europe, there was a little more coverage too. But generally, given how important a meeting between the Russian and American presidents still is, the lack of coverage and discussion of this meeting is remarkable. Why is this the case? Well, I think the answer is because the media in the United States, in Britain and in Europe is struggling to understand what is going on, because from their point of view, this is completely unexpected and in some ways perhaps even unwelcome. I say that because in the run-up to President Biden's election victory and his subsequent inauguration, in all the time that President Biden was a presidential candidate, he had been giving every impression that he would take a much stronger line against Russia than his predecessor as president, Donald Trump, did. In fact, as we know, over the last 5 years, there has been a relentless narrative pushed both in the United States and in Britain and in Europe that Donald Trump was somehow in Putin's pocket and was going out of his way to protect the Russian leader and Russia from severe consequences that they deserved as a result of their supposedly incessant meddling and aggression around the world and against the United States in particular. And President Biden, Joe Biden, as a candidate, seemed to confirm this belief. He too spoke about Donald Trump's unhealthy connections to Putin. He never contradicted statements like those regularly made by Nancy Pelosi to the effect that with Trump, all roads led back to Putin. And he gave every impression that he too would want to take on the Russians in a serious way, ending the policy of appeasement that the Trump administration had been following. Well, he became president on 20th January 2021, and very soon after doing so, he began to take a radically different course from the one that everybody expected that he would take. Shortly after he became president, President Biden telephoned President Putin and agreed there and then, in that very first call, that the United States and Russia would renew the New START treaty, the treaty limiting strategic weapon systems possessed by the United States and Russia, a treaty which the Donald Trump administration had been preparing to pull out of, that he would renew that treaty with the Russians for 5 years to allow further arms control negotiations to take place, and he would do that without any of the kind of preconditions that the Trump administration had been insisting on as a condition for renewing that treaty. That was, as I discussed in a video at the time, a very significant concession made by Biden on behalf of the United States to the Russians. Barely reported as such in the media at the time, but that is what it was. The weeks then passed, and we heard rumours that a very powerful new sanctions package was being prepared, and that the new administration was carrying out a detailed review of its policies with respect to Russia. Supposedly, and according to what we were hearing, the United States was considering how it would respond to the SolarWinds hack, to Russian meddling in the 2020 election, and to the alleged persecution of the Russian dissident politician and blogger Alexei Navalny. And indeed, eventually in April, a sanctions package did appear. However, the package turned out to be toothless. As I discussed in another video that I did back in April, the sanctions which Biden announced, which appeared to restrict the ability of US investors to invest in Russian sovereign debt, were actually meaningless and were completely without effect. The international money markets looked at the sanctions and agreed, and in fact, in the days after the sanctions were announced, the ruble strengthened, Russian financial markets rose, and it became very clear that the markets had decided that the sanctions were completely ineffectual, which of course they were. Then, over the last few weeks, a number of other things have started to happen. Firstly, there was that very strange business of the Colonial Pipeline. Now, the Colonial Pipeline stopped operating, causing gasoline shortages on the east coast of the United States, and it was alleged and claimed that this was the result of a hack carried out by a criminal hacking group based in Eastern Europe, with most saying that it was actually based in Russia. Now, I know that there are some people who watch this video who are skeptical about that story, who question the story about the hack. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to accept that it happened. I know nothing else that would lead me to think otherwise. The interesting fact about this hack or alleged hack of the Colonial Pipeline was the fact that the United States government went out of its way to say that the Russian government had not been directly involved, even if Russian criminals had been involved in doing it. That is a major break. That is something entirely new. Now, I should say that I'm absolutely clear in my own mind that the Russian government was not involved in any conceivable hack of the Colonial Pipeline. But since when has the United States and its European allies bothered with the little matter of the absence of evidence of Russian involvement in something before they go ahead and accuse Russia of involvement in that something? If the United States had wanted to accuse Russia of involvement in the Colonial Pipeline hack, it would have done so. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that if something like that had happened to the Colonial Pipeline whilst Donald Trump was president, the whole media would have said that it was Russia and Putin which was behind it. The intelligence agencies of the United States would have issued intelligence assessments saying that that was almost certainly the case. We would have had calls for sanctions, and some kind of sanctions would indeed have been announced. It's a remarkable fact that nothing like that took place. Then, a few days later, we had a further announcement that the United States would waive sanctions on the German operator of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, greenlighting the construction of that pipeline and effectively admitting that that pipeline would indeed be built, a pipeline which the Donald Trump administration had done everything in its power to prevent being completed. And in fact, we now have further statements from President Biden himself in which he has expressly and explicitly admitted that the pipeline will indeed be built, that Nord Stream 2 will indeed be finished, and that there is nothing that he can actually do to prevent it being built. Well, that may be true. The last may be true. But of course, that would not have prevented, and that did not prevent the Trump administration from going ahead and imposing sanctions on all sorts of people, including German companies involved in building and operating Nord Stream 2. The United States has never in the past, in any project involving Russia, declined to impose sanctions simply because those sanctions would be ineffective. On the contrary, the sanctions have more often than not been entirely disconnected to any practical effectiveness. The fact that the United States decided that it would not impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2 was, as I discussed in a recent video, definitely a significant symbolic concession by the United States to Moscow. And then lastly, over the last few days, we've had another incident. This is the incident involving the Belarusian government's diversion of a Ryanair jet to Minsk, which is a jet that had been flying from Athens to Vilnius in Lithuania. They diverted it to Minsk, sending up a MiG-29 fighter jet to bring it to ensure that it did come down in Minsk. And their arrest when the plane landed in Minsk of Roman Protasevich, a Belarusian dissident, an activist, a person involved in the setting up the Nexta Telegram channel, which had played a pivotal role in organizing the protests against Belarusian President Lukashenko's government last year. Well, in the hours after this incident, which caused a huge outcry across Europe, there were all sorts of claims from all sorts of people, notably the British government and specifically British Foreign Minister Dominic Raab, that the Russians had been involved in some way in that particular incident, and that it was the Russians and the Belarusians working together that had made the plane come down. Well, the interesting thing is that within hours of Dominic Raab saying those things, he was, in effect, slapped down by Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who went out of her way to say that Germany had no evidence of any Russian involvement in the forcing down by Belarus of the Ryanair jet and in the arrest of Mr. Protasevich. And the fact that Merkel was acting in close coordination with the US administration is confirmed by the fact that within an hour of her making those comments, the US administration was saying exactly the same thing. The blame supposedly rests entirely with President Lukashenko and his government, and the Russians, it seems, were not involved. Well, again, I don't know one way or the other, but I would point out that even if there is no evidence of Russian involvement in the Protasevich arrest, that has never held the West back from blaming Russia for incidents like that and for imposing sanctions on Russia in the absence of such evidence in the past. The fact is that the US and its German ally clearly, deliberately acted in advance of the sanctions announcement to ensure that the Protasevich incident did not derail that announcement by dialing down any information campaign against Russia that might be provoked by it. The British clearly did not get the message, and they've been left to some extent looking foolish and high and dry. Anyway, these have all been public things, but of course there have also been more practical steps which also point to a US desire to de-escalate tensions. And of those, by far the most important, surely, was the US decision back in April to cancel the deployment of 2 Arleigh Burke US Navy destroyers to the Black Sea at a time when there seemed to be a real possibility of a military conflict in eastern Ukraine, which might have involved Russia. President Biden, in that telephone call to Putin, in which he suggested to Putin the summit meeting, apparently specifically told Putin that that he'd taken the decision to cancel the deployment of these 2 warships to the Black Sea as part of a US decision to seek de-escalation. The British, again, were clearly not consulted and were clearly annoyed by the decision because, as I've discussed in earlier videos, they announced that they were going to go ahead with the deployment of their warships to the Black Sea, which they had decided on, presumably in coordination with the Americans earlier, and would disregard the US administration's decision to cancel its deployments of its warships to the Black Sea. Well, that brave British stand didn't last very long. As I've again discussed in a recent programme, somehow or other, probably after receiving some sort of stern lecture from Washington, the British also decided quietly to shelve the idea of sending Royal Navy warships into the Black Sea. The only British warship that's been sent to the Black Sea is not the guided missile destroyer and guided missile frigate the British had originally been speaking about, but instead a patrol boat. So once again, we see the British being left high and dry. So we see a steady pattern of the United States ever since the Biden administration took office, seeking de-escalation with Russia. And moreover, this has clearly become more intense since April. What lies behind it? I think there are two straightforward reasons. The first is great alarm about what seems to have nearly happened in Ukraine in April. As we remember, in March and April, the Ukrainian military redeployed its forces along the contact line separating Ukraine from the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. There was a lot of talk at that time, including a lot of talk in Ukraine itself, that Ukraine was preparing a military offensive in eastern Ukraine to roll over these two republics and to forcibly reassimilate them into Ukraine. There were changes to Ukraine's law at that time, and it did seem as if something of that nature might have been intended. Well, all those Ukrainian moves provoked a massive Russian counter-response. There was a huge build-up of forces by Russia on Ukraine's border, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov started giving interviews in which he spoke about a war launched by Ukraine against the two Donbass republics, resulting in the destruction of Ukraine itself. Now, all of that caused massive panic across the West. There were dismayed comments appearing in European capitals, frantic calls to Moscow and implicitly to Kiev to de-escalate, assurances extracted from the Ukrainians that they were not, in fact, intending to use force to settle the situation in the Donbass, and cold refusals of urgent Ukrainian requests for Ukraine's entry into NATO to be accelerated. And in fact, the situation as a result of all of these efforts was indeed de-escalated. The United States and its European allies were forced to confront a reality in April that if there were a war in eastern Ukraine, not only would the Russian military overwhelm the Ukrainian military, probably within a matter of days, but Ukraine itself would be destroyed, and that massive investment of US resources and prestige in Ukraine would go for nothing. The United States itself would be rendered powerless, since there is no possibility of the United States going to war on Ukraine's behalf. And at the end of that process, with Ukraine destroyed, there would have been a political crisis in Washington on a scale that we have not seen since the fall of China to the communists in the early 1950s. That obviously was something that the Biden administration wanted to avoid at all costs, which is why they took all those urgent steps over the course of April to de-escalate the situation, which included Biden's call to Putin and his suggestion for a summit meeting in June. So that is perhaps the single event which provoked the decision to invite Putin to a summit as early as this summer. But over and above Ukraine, there is an even greater overarching issue, the one which I think explains the underlying strategy that the Biden administration is following, and which explains why the Biden administration appears to be looking for what it calls a predictable and stable relationship with Russia in Europe, if you like, a kind of geopolitical ceasefire, rather than seek the kind of confrontation that many people expected. That is the overriding fear that many people in Washington have, that with the United States locked with confrontation with Russia in Europe and locked simultaneously in confrontation with China in the Pacific and the South China Sea, the United States is in great danger of becoming dangerously overextended. The US cannot take on Russia and China simultaneously on two fronts at the same time. And a decision was made that given that China was clearly the more potent adversary, that some kind of geopolitical ceasefire with Russia should be sought in Europe to enable the United States to focus its energies on confronting China in the Pacific and in the South China Sea. That, I think, is the underlying cause for the Biden administration's moves. I suspect that there would have been a suggestion for a summit meeting between Biden and Putin, irrespective of what happened in Ukraine in April at some point. Probably it would not have happened quite so soon. Maybe the administration would have waited a few more months in order for things to settle down, but that was probably always the agenda of some people in the administration, Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken especially, but I'm guessing some people in the Pentagon also, and perhaps CIA Director Bill Burns, and that the events in Ukraine in April perhaps caused them to bring forward the agenda for that summit earlier than they had intended, but it only accelerated the direction of travel rather than changed it. That's my guess anyway. So that, I think, is why the Biden administration, why Biden is going to meet Putin in Geneva in June. Partly it is to make sure that the crisis in Ukraine is kept under some sort of control. Partly it also is in order to see whether there can be some kind of geopolitical ceasefire with Russia in Europe. Perhaps also, and this has been discussed in those many interesting foreign affairs publications that you find in Washington, perhaps there might also be attempts by the US to see whether there is some way of peeling Russia away from China, ending this alliance that the Russians and the Chinese are quietly building and which poses such enormous challenges to the United States. So what is the United States going to come to discuss when it meets with Putin in Geneva? Well, strategic arms will undoubtedly be part of the topics which will be discussed. And I did a recent program in which I spoke about US concerns about the destabilizing nature of some Russian weapon systems, specifically the underwater Poseidon nuclear-powered drone, which is capable of launching devastating attacks against the US coastline, devastating vast areas of the United States, destabilizing its economy, and creating, in effect, a crisis of biblical proportions. The United States is clearly worried about those weapons, and it will want to restrict them to the extent that it can, and certainly find out from the Russians under what circumstances the Russians might be minded to deploy it and even to use it. And of course, there will be some general discussions about regional conflicts, of which the most important one, obviously, is Ukraine. But, as I also discussed in recent programs, it was striking that when Lavrov and Blinken met in Reykjavik, the discussion they had with each other did not seem to go into great specifics about any issues, but was confined to a somewhat meandering talk about generalities. Clearly, the US, mindful of the political effects in Washington of appearing to make concessions to Moscow on specific issues at this time is reluctant to be pinned down. But the Russians, for their part, are going to come to Geneva with a very definite agenda and a very clear desire to see progress on certain issues. And we know from various things that the Russians have been saying, especially from on the part of Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov, the kind of things that are uppermost in the Russians' mind. Firstly, obviously, they too are interested in some measure of strategic arms control. This has always been for them a serious question, and they're absolutely open to discussion about it. They also, by the way, want to extend those discussions to talk about a cyberspace treaty, something that they have been talking about with the Americans for a long time, an idea which the US has been resisting, but which the Russians probably at this summit will press. They want to see steps agreed between themselves and the United States and the other great powers to bring some degree of control and order to cyberspace, preventing the use of hacking weapons and viruses and cyber bombs and all that sort of thing between the great powers. We will see how receptive the US is to those ideas. The second issue is one which the Russians have talked about many times, but especially Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov. Lavrov, who is of course himself the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, seems to be particularly aggrieved by the fact that in 2016, at the height of the Russiagate affair, President Obama, in the last weeks of his administration, expelled dozens of Russian diplomats from the United States and seized Russian diplomatic properties in the United States. That set in train a series of tit-for-tat expulsions of diplomats by the Russians and the Americans, and by the Russians and the US's European allies, which have continued ever since. Lavrov wants this spiral of tit-for-tat expulsions to be brought to a stop, and he has made it very clear that he actually wants the expulsions to some extent to be reversed, and for that diplomatic property which was seized by the US in the last days of the Obama administration to be returned to Russia. We will see whether the United States agrees to that. But there is the other issue, the most important issue for the Russians of all, and that is Ukraine. And here we have further clarification of the matter from Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov, given in a massive interview he gave to Russia's Argumenty Fakty newspaper. And much of it was connected to the summit meeting, the prospective summit meeting, but some of it, most of it, a huge part of it, in fact, was devoted specifically to events in Ukraine. And it is so important and so interesting that I'm going to read long extracts from what Lavrov said. And firstly, you have the question. And it's important to say that this question put to Lavrov by the interviewer was clearly planted and prearranged, and it gave Lavrov an opportunity to discuss these issues. Anyway, this was the question. Experts are interpreting the accumulation of troops around Donbass in April as a risk of a new dangerous escalation, and are even comparing the situation with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Can a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, another aggravation is possible any day, really detonate a third world war? Now, if you remember, a few weeks ago, I did a program for this channel in which I discussed how the former Russian president, and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the Deputy Chief of Russia's Security Council, actually wrote an article which was published in English on the Sputnik website, in which he compared directly the events which took place in Ukraine in April with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And here we see in this question again that parallel between the situation in Ukraine and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis being made once more. Anyway, this is what Lavrov said in reply. First of all, I would like to point out that the conflict in Donbass is an internal Ukrainian armed conflict. It is a consequence of the coup d'etat that brought radical nationalist forces to power in Kiev. Ukrainian radicals and nationalists started enforcing their rules and cracking down on those who rejected them, including the Donbass residents who are simply protecting their freedom, national and cultural identity, and the right to speak their native language. The Ukrainian authorities refused to recognize their legitimate interests or to grant a special status to Donbass as stipulated in the Minsk agreements. Instead, Kiev is trying to lay the blame on Russia and present it as a party to the conflict, demanding the adoption of tougher anti-Russian sanctions. The planned military exercises of the Russian armed forces are held every year, concluding the winter-spring period of combat training. They are held on Russian territory, a considerable distance away from Donbass. It is these exercises, which have already ended, that Kiev, supported by Western countries, try to present as an aggravation of tension. I would like to use this occasion to point out the military build-up of the United States and its NATO allies in Ukraine and the Black Sea. They are sending weapons and providing financial and material assistance to the Ukrainian army, as well as teaching the Ukrainian military the NATO methods of warfare. 7 joint military exercises with NATO countries are to be held in Ukraine in 2021 alone. In other words, military drills will be held there every 6 to 8 weeks. Ukrainian troops are taking part in the large-scale NATO exercise Defender Europe 2021. Russia has to take all of this into account in its military planning. And lastly, needless to say, the militarization of Ukraine is not facilitating a settlement of the conflict in Donbass. Now, notice a few points before we go on. Firstly, Lavrov does not deny that the situation in Ukraine in April was comparable to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. He leaves that part of the question unanswered in a way which implies that he agrees. He also goes out of his way to criticize NATO military involvement in Ukraine, suggesting that that involvement threatens peace and may lead to a conflict in Ukraine, which implicitly would be analogous to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And though he is careful to say that the military exercises which Russia undertook in April 2021 along Ukraine's border were exercises of a sort that happened regularly, he was also careful not to deny that those exercises, which took place on a far bigger scale this year than usual, were related to events in Ukraine. Lavrov chose his words extremely carefully in an exchange with the questioner from Argumenty Fakty, which is clearly very carefully pre-prepared. What Lavrov is saying is that the West, by providing military backing to Ukraine, is in danger of replicating a crisis as dangerous as that of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and if that happens, Russia's military is ready to respond, and as it showed it could do during the exercises it undertook in April 2021. Anyway, that was what he said about the situation in April. But then, of course, he had an awful lot more to say about the general contours of a Ukrainian settlement. And then we have again the question, and again the question to Lavrov is clearly pre-prepared and planted. Kiev has been speaking increasingly more often about revising the Minsk agreements. How would you explain this position, and what can be done if Ukraine does not want to implement these agreements? Is there any way out of this deadlock? And then Lavrov replied to the question as follows. Indeed, Kiev has been talking about this increasingly more often. President Zelensky has stated recently that the Minsk agreements are needed not to settle the conflict, but to preserve sanctions against Russia. The head of the Ukrainian delegation at the Trilateral Contact Group, Leonid Kravchuk, said that the Minsk agreements are a political millstone round Ukraine's neck and one of the obstacles that is preventing the settlement of the conflict. These statements cannot be assessed as anything other than refusal to implement the Minsk package. The reason for this is only too obvious. The Kiev authorities' rating is going down, and the peace in Donbass promised by Zelensky is nowhere in view. It appears that Kiev believes that the granting of a special status to the separate districts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions as component parts of the Ukrainian state, which is a key factor of the Minsk agreements, will hinder the implementation of the current Ukrainian policy, a policy of far-right nationalism, Russophobia, enforced Ukrainization, the suppression of independent media outlets, the persecution of dissenters, and severance of centuries-old ties between our nations. There is also an explanation for Kiev's stubborn desire to change the sequence of the implementation of the Minsk package by placing the entire length of the Russian-Ukrainian border under Ukrainian control before holding local elections in Donbass. They are not even trying to keep secret their subsequent plans, which provide for the filtration of the population and the internment of the politically unreliable people in concentration camps. Needless to say, the Donbass residents are not enthusiastic about this possibility. The people there have to live amid the horrors of bombing raids and shooting by the Ukrainian armed forces, and are suffering untold hardships because of Kiev's economic blockade. To find a way out of this dead end, the Kiev authorities must decide if they want Donbass to be reintegrated into Ukraine. If they do, the only way towards this goal is strict and consecutive implementation of the Minsk package. I would like to remind you that this document has been approved in a UN Security Council resolution and is thus binding on the conflicting sides, which are Kiev, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Now, we have to unpack this again very carefully, but it's quite clear what Lavrov is saying. He is saying that the problem, the reason why the conflict in Ukraine continues, is because Ukraine refuses to implement the Minsk agreement. it refuses to negotiate, as it is required to do by the Minsk Agreement, directly with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. It refuses to agree with them the framework of a new constitution, the setting up of a new government, and new elections. And as a result, the situation in Ukraine is deadlocked. Moreover, what Lavrov is saying is that the Russians are not going to change the sequencing of the Minsk agreement, despite the Ukraine's requests, continued insistence that it do so. They will not agree to Ukraine gaining control of the border first and then implementing the Minsk agreement as it chooses. The Minsk agreement, as Lavrov carefully reminds the questioner, is part of international law because it has been confirmed as such by a resolution of the United Nations Security Council and is therefore binding on all the parties. Ukraine must carry out the Minsk agreement in conformity with the sequencing which was agreed in Minsk, and there is the threat of what will happen if it doesn't. And we come to the last key words that Lavrov uses. The Kiev authorities, note the way he always refers to the Kiev authorities, never to the Ukrainian government. He clearly does not accept the Zelensky government in Kiev as possessing political legitimacy. The Kiev authorities must decide if they want Donbass to be reintegrated into Ukraine. If they do, the only way towards this goal is strict and consecutive implementation of the Minsk package. The implication is that if Ukraine fails to implement the Minsk agreement in the way that the Russians say, talk directly to the leaders of the two Donetsk republics, agree a constitution, agree a law for autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk, hold elections, form a national government, a government of national unity. If that doesn't happen, then Donetsk and Lugansk will pursue their own independence, and they will do so with Russian support. Implicitly, what Lavrov is saying is that at some point, if Ukraine fails to implement the Minsk agreement, then Russia will recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. At that point, with the citizens of those two republics mostly holding Russian citizenship, the two republics will, from a Russian point of view, be entitled to ask Russia formally for Russian peacekeepers to be introduced to those republics, and Russia will agree. That is the implied threat behind Lavrov's words. It's not spelled out. It's not Russia's preferred choice. They would rather see the Minsk agreement implemented. It's probably not what they intend to do soon. They're probably, in fact, they're undoubtedly prepared to wait, but in time, if Ukraine continues to dig in its heels, that is what Russia will do. At that point, Ukraine will have lost the Donbass forever, just as it has lost Crimea. Now, the Russians will undoubtedly point this out. In fact, I'm sure they have already pointed this out to the United States. And of course, the United States will have threatened Russia with sanctions if Russia were to take that step. But as I've discussed many times on programs for this channel, and as the United States is gradually coming to realize these sanctions are of ever diminishing effectiveness. Soon they will be completely symbolic and entirely ineffective because of the steps the Russians have taken. So that is the warning the Russians are giving about what will eventually happen if the Minsk agreement is not fully implemented. And of course, implicit behind that warning is that if the United States does not urge Kiev to implement the Minsk agreement in full, following the correct, strict and consecutive sequencing that the Russians are insisting upon and which is laid out in the Minsk agreement, then at some point the United States will face a crisis in Ukraine on its hands, because it will then find itself in a situation where Russia is backing openly the independence of the two breakaway republics. If the United States therefore does want a ceasefire, a geopolitical ceasefire with Russia in Eastern Europe, then in its own interests, it needs to come to the conclusion that Ukraine must be pressured to implement the Minsk agreement in full on the basis that the Russians are insisting upon. Well, will the United States agree to that? Will the United States do that? We shall have to wait and see. At the moment, I think it's going to be very difficult, probably politically impossible, for President Biden to simply agree to that kind of Russian demand. But he will be aware, as his administration will be, that that is indeed what the Russian game plan for Ukraine eventually is. Of course, implicit in all of this is that things might go much further in Ukraine. There might be a bigger crisis. There might be a war there. Ukraine might be destroyed. The political crisis the Biden administration is desperate to avoid might happen. And for that reason also, it is in the Biden administration's interests and in the US's interests to see a resolution of this crisis in Ukraine. Perhaps we will start to see movement, at least quiet movement, be taken in that direction that the Russians are talking about. After all, it's been striking that recently US officials have been increasingly speaking about the need for full implementation of the Minsk agreement, something that they did not tend to say before, and which clearly is a shift of position from the earlier stance the United States was taking about the situation in Ukraine. Anyway, that, I suspect, is the agenda the Russians are going to come with when they meet Biden in Geneva. They will talk about strategic arms control. They will talk about the end for the war of diplomatic expulsions, but they will mainly be focused upon a resolution of the crisis in Ukraine. And of course, they will come further with an implicit warning. I said right at the start of this immense video that the thing that is driving US policy, the overarching issue, is the US need or desire for a geopolitical ceasefire with Russia, and perhaps for steps to try to peel Russia away from China, given the enormous challenge the de facto alliance between Russia and China is increasingly posing for the United States. Well, Lavrov finished his interview with Argumenty, in fact, Fakty, by discussing that Chinese-Russian alliance, by making it clear that so far as the Russians are concerned, that an alliance is non-negotiable with the Americans, but giving the Americans also an implicit warning that it can go much further, that the Russians and the Chinese can develop it to a far greater degree if the United States does not start taking steps to de-escalate the situation, the conflict with the Russians in Europe than it has done up to now. And I'm going to read out again the very important comments that Lavrov said. And again, I will start by reading the question that was put to him, which, like the previous questions in this long interview, was clearly agreed between the Russian Foreign Ministry and Argumenty, Fakty, in advance. The question is as follows. China and Russia are on the same side of the barricade in countering the United States. Could Moscow and Beijing strike an alliance in this context? Probably even a military-political union. Well, what does political-military union actually mean? I don't know. Does it mean a superstate? Does it mean Russia and China merging their armies and their political institutions and their political leaderships, perhaps with each country retaining some degree of economic and political autonomy? Or does it mean something looser? It's not explained. But consider how Lavrov responds. Russia-China relations are developing rapidly. Today they are at the highest point in their history, largely because the existing model of bilateral ties is superior to some extent to the level of interstate cooperation of the unions formed during the Cold War. What Lavrov is saying here is that the Russian-Chinese friendship today is actually stronger and operates at a higher level than the Soviet-Chinese alliance did of the 1950s, but remarkably, it's even closer and even higher than the Soviet alliance with its Warsaw Pact allies was during the Cold War. It's pretty remarkable. That suggests a degree of political military interaction that is unprecedented between allies, certainly since the Cold War. Anyway, he then goes on to say as follows, the following. The fundamental principles of our relations are laid down in the Treaty of Good Neighbourly Relations, Friendship and Cooperation. In July, we will observe the 20th anniversary of this treaty. Today, both our Chinese partners and we are satisfied with the existing format of cooperation. It allows us to resolve any, even the most difficult issues in a bilateral dialogue, effectively uphold our interests in multilateral associations, and coordinate our approaches in the world arena. By working together, Russia and China are exerting a positive, stabilizing influence on the global and regional situation. So that's how they're working together at the moment. They're working together on all kinds of things. They have a very satisfactory existing format of cooperation. They're able to resolve all issues, even the most difficult issues between them, as part of their bilateral dialogue. And they're working together and coordinating their approaches in the world arena, thereby securing their respective interests and, as Lavrov says, preserving peace. So that's the happy state of affairs at the moment. But then consider what Lavrov says next, and bear in mind the question about China and Russia perhaps one day forming an open alliance, and perhaps even probably affecting something that is called a military political union. This is how Lavrov ends his interview with Argumenty in Fakty. These are his final words. Of course, The world situation is changing rapidly. My friend and colleague, Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi, emphasized in his recent interview with the Xinhua news agency that Russia-China cooperation does not have a final ending point, taboo issues, or an upper limit. I agree with his assessment. No final ending point, no taboo issues, no upper limit. What does that mean? Isn't that perhaps suggesting that this political military union might one day become a reality? Might they indeed form some kind of superstate? Something more than just an alliance, perhaps? Might they indeed merge their political and military leaderships in some way, even if they do preserve economic and cultural autonomy from each other in other ways? Well, who's to say? But note the extraordinary words. No final ending point, no taboo issues, no upper limit. Well, here again, you can regard that as completely far-fetched, if you like, but this is clearly a warning to the United States. If the United States does not agree that geopolitical ceasefire with Russia in Europe, which means substantial concessions, specifically and most importantly on the issue of Ukraine, then it must look forward at some point before very long. And again, Lavrov was careful to say that the world situation is changing rapidly. It must look forward to a gigantic behemoth, a united Eurasia, bringing together all the gigantic forces, the colossal forces of China and Russia in a strategic, military and political alliance which will not only bestride the world, but which will dwarf the resources, the combined resources of the United States and its allies. That is the warning of what will happen if the United States continues to dig in and refuses to make concessions, substantive concessions, and refuses to compromise. Is that a real threat? Is that a real danger? Well, I know that there are many, many people in Washington and in London and in Brussels who doubt it. They continue to believe that at some point in the future, the Chinese and the Russians will fall out. But perhaps those hopes are wishful thinking, and perhaps a wiser thing would be to take these warnings that the Russians are giving, and which, by the way, the Chinese are also giving, seriously. Perhaps the more prudent course is to take these warnings seriously and to accept that if the United States wants to preserve its freedom of action and its geopolitical position and wants to avoid the strategic nightmare of being up against a united Eurasian colossus made up of the aggregate power of China and Russia together, it needs to come to terms. In a recent discussion I had on Fault Lines Radio with my good friend Ray McGovern, who of course used to read the US intelligence brief to US presidents, including Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Ray McGovern, who's far better informed about these things than me, said that the Russians in negotiations like this like to hold informal meetings with the US president, and they like to point out to him over the course of these informal discussions what the general strategic picture is. They will warn Biden that if he isn't careful, the United States could find itself in facing a strategic challenge, the like of which it has never imagined, let alone faced before. Perhaps that is what will happen in Geneva. Personally, I have no doubt that it is. Will Biden listen? Is he even capable of listening? Does he have the political strength to act in the way that is in the US's interests if he does? All that remains to be seen. However, it is clear that this summit meeting is going to be of seminal importance. Their unwillingness by the media in the West to cover it or to discuss it could not be more wrong. I suspect that it is going to be a pivotal event in shaping the future of our world. Thank you for joining me for this long, extended, and very complex video on this very complex and difficult subject. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and our main channel, The Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also join me. Please also check out Alex's own channel and check us out on our various new platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey, SuperU, and Locals. You find links under this video. Please also support us to the extent that you can via Patreon, PayPal, and Subscribestar. Please also remember to go to our Discord server and to check out our shop and look up the wonderful things you will find there. Our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please check your subscription to this channel. All sorts of strange things are apparently happening to the subscriptions of many of our subscribers. And last but not least, remember to press the like button if you like this video. My apologies that it has been so long, but this is obviously a complex subject. And I hope you enjoyed the video, assuming you got through to the end. And thank you very much for joining me, if you did. And I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel, which I promise you will be shorter. Thank you for joining me again, and have a wonderful day.